Today we are back in the awesome storytelling world of Mr. BALLEN. He's brought a brand new video out called Top 3 Strange But True. You won't see this coming. We never do, but I'm looking forward to it. I would literally listen to anything that this guy told me because he's that good at telling stories. He's just the best. Come on, Mr. Ballen, let's see what these top 3 strange but true stories are about and why we won't see them coming. High stakes. Okay. Is it a poker game?
On October 20th, 1986, Captain Alexander Kluyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to...
So I've got a feeling that this is going to be a complacency story.
so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zernov, and he said, "Hey, Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt the landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle. Otherwise, you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed. And to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear. Like, clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle, abort the landing."
Wow.
But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady...
Are you having a laugh? It's strange but true. This is a true story. If it was your plane and him and nobody else on board, do what you want. Well, not really, because you cause a kerfuffle at the airport. But you've got 94 passengers. Oh, that is irresponsible. They better land this plane now.
Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane. And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off, and so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear. The plane skidded all the way down the runway and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived.
Real photos, these are real photos. Oh my God.
A plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
15 years? Is that all? He should have got life for that. He's killed 70 people. For a bet.
Well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
That's scandalous. Why? Why would you play with people's lives like that? You know what I mean? Oh my God, landing a plane blind. Oh, I don't like flying as it is, me. I'm going to be like that next time I go on a plane. Yeah, mate. Is it too mundane for you? You know what I mean? Don't have no blinds. Just land properly. People's ignorance kills me. Family dinner. Let's see what this story's about.
On August 23rd, 2013, inside of a little home in a Russian suburb,
Russia again.
Maria Chelyasheva was hard at work at her kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse. Maria's parents had recently brought her to a farm where she was able to do some pony riding, and ever since then, she had become obsessed with horses and ponies. And so as Maria was hard at work on her drawing, her father, 42-year-old Mikhail, was right nearby at the kitchen stove dicing up onions, and as he did, his eyes were kind of watering from cutting the onions, and so he was making a show of turning around and looking at his daughter, pretending to cry, and Maria thought it was very funny. And then at some point, as Mikhail was doing this, he realized he was missing a key ingredient for the dinner he was preparing. So he kind of threw up his hands in exasperation, and then he yelled out into the house to his wife, you know, hey, do we have any potatoes? And from somewhere in the back of the house, Maria's mother called back, yes, we do. They're down in the cellar, but they're pretty old. And so Mikhail finished chopping his onions, he threw them into a hot pan, and then he walked out of the kitchen, poking Maria playfully as he walked by, and she kind of laughed at him. And then Maria watched as her father walked through the living room, past Maria's grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway. And then
that door looks like something out of Resident Evil. Skip the potatoes.
Grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway, and that door led down into the cellar. And so Maria, she stopped for a moment and just watched as her dad opened the cellar door, began walking down the steps, and he shut the door behind him. And then Maria just went back to coloring in her horse. But after a few minutes, Maria started to smell something really bad, and she looked up and she saw the onions that were on the burner were starting to burn, and smoke was going up into the ceiling, and then suddenly the smoke alarm went off, and as this commotion is happening, Maria's grandmother runs into the kitchen and begins fanning the smoke. She turns off the burner and moves the onions, and then Maria's mother comes running into the kitchen, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's looking around. She doesn't see her husband, and so very frustratedly, she yells out, Mikhail, you burned the onions. Come in and deal with this. But Mikhail was not on the first floor. He was still down in the cellar. And so Maria's mother knew that, and she was kind of annoyed that he was taking so long down there. And so after muttering something under her breath, she stormed out of the kitchen, walked over to the cellar door, opened it up, went downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Maria's grandmother was now going through the burned onions, looking for any that were salvageable, and Maria had gone back to her horse drawing.
Just cook them again.
After about 5 minutes, it dawned on Maria that her parents had still not come out of the cellar yet, and it just felt like too much time had passed. They should be up by now. And so Maria stopped working on her picture and just stared down the hall at the cellar door. And at the same time, Maria's grandmother had stopped with the onions, and she too had come over and was watching from right next to Maria down the hall at the cellar door. Both of them just expecting the parents to emerge any second. But as the seconds ticked by, nobody emerged from the cellar. And so finally, Maria's grandmother said, okay, I'm going to go see what's going on. And so Maria watched as her grandmother walked through the living room, past Maria's brother, who was playing a video game. And then Maria's grandmother, right in front of the closed cellar door, just yelled out, hey, are you guys okay down there? But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this...
It's the Blair Witch Project. Blair Witches, Adam. They'll be stood in the corner watching one of them get killed.
Just yelled out, hey, are you guys okay down there? But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this, Maria's grandmother turned around and told Maria's brother to turn off his video game because it was so noisy. You know, maybe they were calling from the cellar and they couldn't hear them. And so the brother, who was just totally frustrated by this whole situation, he paused his game. And then Maria's grandmother called out again, you know, hey, are you guys okay down there? And this time, when there was still silence, Maria's brother, he just stood up and said, okay, why don't we just go downstairs and make sure they're okay? Why aren't we doing that? And so without waiting for a response from his grandmother, Maria's brother just walked right over to the cellar door. He opened it up and he looked down and he goes, look, they're right there. And then the brother began walking down the steps, yelling to his parents, hey, come on, when's dinner? What's going on? And as he did, he shut the door behind him. And so after this, Maria's grandmother walked back into the kitchen and sat with Maria as the two of them stared at the cellar door, expecting their family to return any second now. But they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were...
This is... how is this... What? I don't know what's going to go on here. You won't see this coming, it says on the tagline. And I don't know what's going on. I'm stuck in the Blair Witch mode.
Any second now, but they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were really starting to panic. They could tell something was wrong. And so Maria's grandmother grabbed her phone and called a neighbor and just said, hey, can you come over? I think something's wrong. I don't know what it is. And then after Maria's grandmother hung up the phone, instead of waiting for the neighbor to come over, Maria's grandmother just got up and walked right over to the cellar door, then opened the door and began walking down the stairs. But this time, the grandmother left the door open. And so Maria was able to listen from her seat in the kitchen to the sound of her grandmother's footsteps making their way down the stairs. And then at some point, Maria heard what sounded like a distinct thud and then silence. Now, at this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else...
Oh, I think I know what's happened. It's going to be like monoxide poisoning or something like that, or there's going to be a gas leak and people are just passing out as they go down. That's my prediction.
At this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else to do, she just got up and walked over to the open cellar door and just stared down into the darkness down below. She couldn't see anything, but she was too scared to even call out to her family. And then finally, she just began descending the stairs herself. 10 minutes later, the neighbor who Maria's grandmother had called finally arrived over at their house. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer, and so he tried the doorknob, found it unlocked, so he opened it up and he stepped inside. And right away, he looked around and it was totally quiet. There was nobody on the first floor of the house. But the neighbor immediately heard crying, and he walked around the first floor listening for where it was coming from, and he realized when he got to the top of the open door leading down into the cellar that the crying was coming from down there. And so without a thought, the neighbor just ran down the stairs, and he couldn't believe what he found. He found Maria, the 8-year-old, just crying on the ground, and all around her was her entire family just laying on the ground. Now, the neighbor had no idea what was going on, but sensing clearly there was some sort of emergency based on the call he got and what he was seeing now, he just scooped up Maria, ran upstairs and ran out of the house and began screaming for help. When help arrived, they would search the house and make their way down into the cellar, and they would discover that Maria's entire family, her grandmother, her brother, her parents, they were all dead. And what had killed them were the very potatoes that Mikhail had gone down to get. It would turn out Maria's mother was right when she warned Mikhail that the potatoes they had downstairs were very old. In fact, they were so old, they had begun to rot, and as they rotted, they produced this toxic fume that did not ventilate out of the cellar. The cellar was totally enclosed, there was no windows, and the family had this habit of always shutting the door whenever they went down into the cellar. And so over time, this fume had totally filled the entire cellar, and one by one, as family members went down into the cellar, sealing the door behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was...
I wasn't too far away when I said about the carbon monoxide poisoning or the gas leak or whatever, but it was potatoes. What? Can you imagine that? Death by potato. And Maria's probably still alive because she never shut the door behind her. Is that what he's going to say now, do you think? And it was just enough oxygen in there.
Behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was the only one who survived going down into the cellar because her grandmother, who had gone down right before her, had left the door open. And so by the time Maria had gone down, a lot of the toxic fumes had found their way up the stairs and escaped into the rest of the house. And so when Maria went down there, it was not nearly as toxic.
Wow.
Thank you to BetterHelp for...
Killed by rotting potatoes. That's unfathomable. Unfathomable. Potatoes. I didn't see it coming. He was right.
For sponsoring today's video. Before I became a professional storyteller, I was a member of the US Navy. And then in 2017, my military career came to a very unexpected and abrupt end. It was like suddenly I was a civilian again after 7 years, and I did not handle that transition well. I had taken for granted all the structure that the military provided on a day-to-day basis, and so not having that structure anymore, it made me feel totally lost. Like I didn't know.
I've heard a lot about this, and with people who's been in the military, they know when they've had a lifestyle for so long, they come back to they can't handle ordinary life. They need to see therapists. They need to see like people who can try and bring them out of this lifestyle change or depression or whatever it is, the PTSD sometimes as well. I mean, wow, you know what I mean? I knew he was like I knew he was in the military forces and stuff, but I've never heard this side of him.
On top of that, all the bills were starting to pile up, and I had not found a job yet. My wife is pregnant with our second kid. I got no idea if we'll even be able to afford this second child. And so I very quickly went into my shell and became a very angry and bitter person. And at some point, my anger issues got so out of hand that my family had a sort of intervention with me and told me, hey, you gotta see a therapist. And I would agree, and it would completely change my life. My therapist quickly showed me that I was not this terrible, angry person, but instead I was someone who was going through a major life change, and it was making me depressed, which is pretty common. And so with my therapist's help, I was able to adjust to this change in my life and really focus on the future and all the good things that were going to happen. And in time, I became a very happy person.
I made a YouTube channel.
Now listen, therapy is not for everyone.
No.
But if you feel kind of lost right now and you don't really know what to do, I think you should give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed
nice way to put it, isn't it?
Therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey online, and then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist, whether that's via text or chat or video or phone call or some combination. Also, you can switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, betterhelp.com/mrballen for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp, and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help.
Head of the family. See, when I read high stakes, I thought it was going to be a poker game, and the high stakes was the bet on landing the plane and betting with the life and the fact that the planes are high stakes. Head of the family, the person who is the head of the family, usually the father or grandfather, whatever, and maybe head of the family. Head off. Maybe it's off with your head of the family. But then again, he said we won't see things coming, so...
On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap
30 years ago
sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed, and she was pretty upset by this, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue, but as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, you know, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room, and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed, and he took her hand, and he just said, you know, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood.
You can't force someone to stay with you. You can't force someone to be in a relationship with you if they don't want to be with you. If you think if everything's going distant and the love's not there anymore, then you should split up. You can't make it work. You can't make someone love you more again. It's you're just setting yourself up.
Divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation.
Good man.
And even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad.
Still not the basis.
But Diane knew that just was not possible.
No.
The relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her. And she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, you know, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, you know, no, don't do that, I'm fine, she could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so, kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, you know, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, you know, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, you know, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, you know, he's really worked up about this. But
I know, but it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. If she's not feeling it and she's, you know, you can't make it happen. It doesn't matter. No amount of pleading. And if she gives in and says, oh, I'll go on then. And then another year goes past and it's like, I still feel the same, let's split up. But you might as well just done it before. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous.
Before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back.
Right.
But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door. The door flung open and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head.
I had one of them.
He'd gone inside of her
Same
house
color
and
as well.
begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way...
Head of the family. The bag is named Head. Could be something to do with the bag. I had exactly the same bag when I was at school.
Gathering things she would want and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized, and just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. You know, maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out.
So he was looking for a place, basically. I thought, why is he suddenly just driving around a base? You know what I mean? He was looking for a place for something. Right, okay.
That's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so...
What the hell could it be where he had to go inside and grab it that he needed? And he's now outside next to a phone booth. Normally you can predict some sort of order in a story. No, I don't know what's going to happen.
But there was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look. And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together, even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did...
So, maybe, speculation-wise, he's got into some sort of crazed blackout. And the way he was holding that is like he was holding a head by its hair. And I feel like he's killed somebody and chopped their head off.
Even though she was pregnant.
No.
Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together. But what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane,
Plot thickens.
I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you.
Finds the person whose baby it is and kills him. Oh my God, that's what's going to happen, isn't it?
Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag, when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute, this person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen. And he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than a friend. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had
poured his heart out to. And he sat there, listened to him pour his heart out to him, knowing that he's nailing his missus, nailing his wife. Be all right, mate. It's okay, mate. No, you might get back together. Yeah. And Eddie's like, oh, no. My bird now. My girl. Oh!
friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, you know, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life.
Right.
And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed. And that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen...
Greg was the thing he was looking for, who's now in the frickin' phone box.
And had gone into the mess hall and then come
phoning
back
Diane,
out again.
probably. Yeah. Oh my God, I've just got the twist. Because the phone went dead, didn't it? Oh, I like this story. It's got me guessing.
And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth.
To Diane.
And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, I'm sorry. He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag, he unzips it, and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court, and he would be sentenced to life in prison.
Wow.
The following is about the most...
I got 1 out of 3. I started getting the plot towards the end, 1 out of 3, but the others, they really baffle me. This guy is so good at telling stories. I feel like I've watched a film, the way he's explained these other stories and that was absolutely brilliant. Oh my God, Mr. Ballen, you are a legend. Oh, we need to do some more reactions to these. What are your favourite Mr. Ballen videos? And I will check them out. Let me know in the comments, because I need more. I need more of a fix. I'm going to be addicted to these videos, I think. I really, really am. I still can't believe someone died by potato. By potato. It just doesn't make sense. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and if you like my videos, then please hit like and subscribe, and I shall see you all in the next video.